Hi there, folks. Tom here with the Heavily Biased Top 10, and you are listening to 2025, Episode 3, the end of the first quarter. So, a little brief recap here. What do we have happen in Week 3? Well, a playoff spot opened up. Is there a new best team in Texas? An identity crisis in the ACC? Some wild finishes in Knoxville and South Bend? Anybody know these teams? We're going to look at a start of discussing a 9-game conference schedule. We hardly knew you, at least this season. And then conference rankings. Let's dive on in and talk some football. So, as you know, I am a big fan of the SEC, and with the history of LSU and Florida, you'd think that the late game on my television Saturday night would be Florida versus LSU. However, with a road game between Texas A&M and Notre Dame and the prospect of Notre Dame starting the season 0-2, my nightcap between LSU and Florida took a backseat to the events in South Bend. I've made no secret from the start of this podcast or from the start of these writings. I am an SEC fan. I am an Alabama fan. And I am not a fan of Notre Dame. Quite often, my favorite 3 teams on any given Saturday are Alabama, no matter who they're playing, an SEC team playing out of conference, and then whoever is playing Notre Dame. So Texas A&M got to be favorite team number 2 and 3 on Saturday. That said, I did respect Notre Dame's schedule this year a lot more than I have in some previous ones. However, a lot of the meat of their schedule came right there at the beginning, where they played Miami and Texas A&M back-to-back. A look at their remaining schedule and this 0-2 start means that their playoff hopes are a 10-win sweep, and they've got to be impressive and hope that Miami and Texas A&M hold as very good teams. I will say the Irish have looked quite strong against 2 opponents who are likely to be AP top 15, but 2 losses to open the season is still 2 losses. How this team is still AP ranked, seeing that I'm recording this Monday, is beyond me. An 0-2 team never should be sitting in the rankings, no matter where they started. This is a reason why I do not rank teams until several weeks into the season, because here we have an instance of somebody that started off ranked very highly, perhaps deserving of that consideration, but after the start that they've had, that's not been a top 25 team. So, who's the best team in Texas? Well, Texas A&M is off to the hottest start in the state of Texas, aside from, tied with Houston, especially with the Texas Longhorns struggling to get their offense going under the direction of Arch Manning. Manning was at one time booed during the first half of the Texas game as they struggled with UTEP. Last season, the glaring weakness of Texas A&M was at wide receiver. Venables has a strong defense there. He's got a very solid run game. He had some quarterback play that, could have used some help, especially from skill positions on the outside. And he really seems to have solved that with 2 very strong receivers. They showed up for a huge game against Notre Dame this past weekend. That leaves the Aggies and Houston as the last standing 3-0 teams from major conferences in the state of Texas. We said from the beginning that I don't really want to punish Texas's loss to Ohio State to start the season, and I want to see kind of where those go. However, so far, a quarter of the way through the season, that has not looked like the Texas that we expect. ACC's identity crisis. Parity is fun. It's entertaining year to year watching the Big 12 play each other and kind of dissolve into chaos. But we watch these games with some expectations about how the conferences are likely to shape up, how the season might play out. And, we get some upsets. We get some teams that really do some interesting things over the course of the year, though we expect some stability and we expect the best teams are usually going to rise to the top. Beginning of the season, I thought that Clemson was going to be one of the best of the ACC. I thought that this was a team that was probably headed towards a playoff spot without too many hiccups. Yes, they had some tough games on their schedule, opening against LSU, playing South Carolina, and then just kind of navigating their ACC schedule. But I did think that that was a possibility for them, especially considering how much Clemson managed to return. Um, Two early season losses, though. You've got a loss to LSU, slated to be one of the better teams in the SEC, and now a conference loss to Georgia Tech. Suddenly, this is a 1-2 team at the quarter point and a game behind in the ACC in early play. Keep in mind, Clemson playing South Carolina at the end of the year means that they will finish their ACC slate a week early, but Miami is now the clear frontrunner. And even with an open playoff spot where Notre Dame has really, really tough hill to climb, the conference outlook here is kind of diminished because the ACC is a lollipop. They've got a big giant head on the top and they've got a twig underneath. So we'll see what becomes of the ACC. Two wild finishes. One we've talked about a little bit. The other is in Knoxville. We'll go in order of those finishes. Every season always has its share. Week 3, we had back-to-back windows. It was amazing to watch. Tennessee, even taking this loss here in overtime to Georgia, they came out with a torrid start. They scored 21 on their opening drives. And in the first quarter, that's a 21-7 lead, only to have Georgia just kind of grind their way back into the game. Really, that's kind of the recipe for Tennessee, as we have seen with Georgia dealing with them so far, is that you just kind of have to weather the storm, get by some of that big explosive play early, get into the game and grind them. It's nearly as rough on Tennessee's offense in several ways to play at the pace that they play as it is on the opposing defense. If you're trying to snap the ball that quickly and you're trying to do that without substitution, you do lead to your receivers on the outside having to make runs, make plays down the field, get back, reset, run it again and again and again. And that kind of pace can wear on both offense and defense. In a lot of cases, we will see just strategically teams that will intentionally sub, even if you're not sure that they need it, when Tennessee will sub as they hold the game or as they hold the snap in order to allow that full substitution. And the way that offense runs, if you let them get out there to a sprint and leave them on the sideline chewing on the bit, which is exactly what Georgia did, you can really make them answer questions. That said, Tennessee had an opportunity. They are a game-winning 43-yard field goal away from having that game won. But that's another interesting piece because with these early season games, if they hit that field goal, then the loser of Alabama-Georgia next week, not this week coming up, but next week, would have started the season 2-2. And that's another big hit, considering that these were two teams that we consider out of the SEC as potential playoff teams. So, what happened in South Bend? That's another interesting tale. As we said, the receivers in Texas A&M looked very strong. Notre Dame played well, ran the ball well, did a lot of very good things for the second game in a row. Not the second week because they've only played 2, but for the second game in a row, only to come up on the short end. So botched extra point leaves the door open. And then what a wild ride for Texas A&M. They immediately return the kickoff for a touchdown, get a holding call that calls it back, have to drive the length of the field. They wind up with a 4th and goal and throw the game-winning pass to a blocking tight end, to a guy who is just barely going out in route, but matched up well on a linebacker. Texas A&M's quarterback made a good position throw and a fantastic catch out of a guy who is definitely not the primary target. And then you get that, and Notre Dame starts out the season 0-2. As we said, when looking at their schedule, I think that 2 of their harder games, not necessarily probably one of their hardest games, and another of their top 3, were played in these first 2 weeks. And so even though their schedule returned more winning teams than it often does, their opportunities to kind of battle their way back in are somewhat limited. The Boise State game that's coming up for them. Boise State's already taken an early season loss. Uh, you know, USC is not going to be the class of the Big Ten. Um, Loading up their schedule with some of the other things that they usually have loaded up. Purdue, I don't think so. But it's going to be interesting to see how that program does and what we bounce back from. But that said, we have a 3-0 Georgia. We have a 3-0 Texas A&M. Tennessee is off to a 2-1 start and looked very strong against a very good Georgia. And for no good reason, the AP still has Notre Dame ranked at 0-2. Anybody know these teams? Let's look at a list. And I will admit I have one wrong on this slide. Penn State, Indiana, Maryland, Northwestern, Rutgers, Washington out of the Big Ten, Houston out of the Big 12, ACC, Wake Forest, and Auburn is the one that I have wrong, but Ole Miss out of the SEC. These are the list of teams without a P4 non-conference game. The SEC in the last couple of weeks, and I will grant that we had quite a lot of turmoil going on, and so this announcement was a little bit pushed to the back burner. The SEC has announced that they are going to move to a 9-game conference schedule. This is closer in line to what we see out of the Big Ten and what we see out of the Big 12. I strongly suspect that in order to match this, we will see the similar move out of the ACC. But what is that going to mean for some of these big games that we've had this season? That's really going to be a question that I think, see a lot of the answer to when we get to the selection committee this year. If we see a 10-2 Indiana that has taken no risk whatsoever be in the playoff over somebody that finishes 9-3 and took one of these big risk games, and then played a strong conference schedule at least equal to or better than what Indiana has played, I think you're going to see a lot of teams that just flatly refuse to play the extra P4 game. In an era that we have, what kind of value does it have to go out and play that extra game if you are not going to be rewarded? A win is a no real reward, because you could have won. You could have gone out and beat Delta State. Didn't matter. Win was a win. You're not going to see these games. If, on the other hand, we start to see some of these things happen where, let's say that we have that we have a 9-3 Texas, that they've kind of turned it around, that they've won some of their games that were the big ones. Yeah, they've taken a couple of lumps in the SEC, but a 6-2 in the SEC team and a loss to Ohio State, if that allows them into the playoff over one of these teams that finishes 10-2 but took no risk whatsoever, then I think we're going to continue to see some of this slate of games that we really liked where we had some major opponents match up week 1, 2, and 3. If not going to happen. Oh, we hardly knew you. Couple of schools have broken with their head coaches after 0-3 starts. Just to give you an idea of who some of these guys are that have been sent packing, UCLA. Deshaun Foster, a former NFL running back and longtime assistant in several places, or assistant in several levels of the UCLA program, was let go by the Bruins after a 0-3 start. He has a 5-10 overall record. This is over less than 2 full years, but losses to Utah, UNLV, and New Mexico to start this campaign sent him packing. The other 0-3 start that has let go of their coach as of Monday was Brent Pry from Virginia Tech. He was 16-24 at Virginia Tech, and he was shown out after a home loss to Old Dominion. I will grant for Brent Pry that he had a pretty tough start, because South Carolina and Vandy, who are, well, let's see what they become. South Carolina looked fairly strong, and then Vandy went right on ahead and beat them. But Vandy beat Virginia Tech worse than South Carolina did. That said, 0-3 start. 16-24 overall record, and Virginia Tech has let him go. Well, you have the line there, next man up. Who do I think is next on the chopping block? That would be Billy Napier. I live down here in Florida right now, and I will say that there is a lot of rumbling. Napier is off to a 1-2 start. Losses to USF, to the South Florida Bulls, and LSU to start the season 1-2. Very concerning. The AP ranks have 7 more teams on the schedule in the remaining 9 games. The lowest of those currently sits at 15. So Florida has easily the hardest remaining schedule that I have seen. The likelihood that they are going to go through that, given their inconsistencies in play, at better than 5-1, is next to impossible. And so to think that Billy Napier is going to last the full season of that is kind of a guessing game. I will say in his defense, what little defense there is, that Florida has allowed 2 touchdowns on defense, and that's it. So defensively, they have done phenomenally well. However, with a quarterback that they believe is a very strongly athletic prospect and a guy who you think is going to be in a similar vein to what Anthony Richardson was, let's remember, Anthony Richardson finished with a losing record in college. Little fun fact, go back to the fog game of 2020, Florida versus LSU. Florida's got a chance to win that game. Defender pulls the shoe off of an LSU player, throws it for a 15-yard penalty. Since then, Florida, losing record. Yeah, that's a not so great run for a program that really wants to be a part of national prominence. All right, conference rankings. We do this every week, and we do this by the projected CFP spots. This week at number 1 is the SEC. It has been a wild ride for the SEC, with 2 of those finishes as earlier described, but their impact is gigantic. One of which is that it really has functionally knocked Notre Dame, who I had as a partial playoff spot, out of the picture. Texas might not be quite in the spot that we thought there were, but you have several teams that are in that place. Texas is still a very good team. They're still a very talented team. They got a lot to get together, but that is a very good team. Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, Texas A&M, LSU have all had strong showings. Auburn has had strong showings. Vandy has played very well here in the early season. So out of a 16-team conference, you still have a wide array of things that can wind up kind of making a top 4, provided they don't just beat each other around and beat each other senseless. 3.8 playoff spots. Big Ten. The largest number of undefeated teams belongs to the Big Ten. They also have the largest number of teams that do not play a Power 4 non-conference opponent. That's going to change rapidly as the Big Ten enters primary conference play this week. The conference as a whole is still kind of clinging to the hat of a 14-7 Ohio State versus Texas game. As we've said so far, Texas does not look like they are the top of the class in the SEC very much right now. And we suspect that Ohio State is probably as good as the Big Ten has. Reasonably, we could see that Oregon or Penn State kind of challenge that. But only Penn State is in one of those positions where they didn't play a Power 4 game. They're going to wind up with a fairly solid schedule through that conference, as will Ohio State, as will Oregon. But that conference play is still kind of somewhat lacking. And the rest of the matchups against the SEC have not been nearly as favorable. In third place, we have the ACC at 2.3 spots. The Georgia Tech upset of Clemson leaves a small but not impossible window for a third spot. Yellow Jackets have won an impressive volume of games as an underdog. I believe that was the 12th or 13th win as an underdog under this coach. And The problem that we have so far is seeing them win when they are a favorite. If they can turn the corner and do that through the balance of the season, then we'll probably have a third solid team vying for a playoff spot. If not, then we've got, probably a two-horse race between right now what we expect would be Miami and Florida State. The Big 12, 1.3 playoff spots, finishes third. This is the conference that is very crowded at the top. The problem is that the top historically and the top this year is not real far from the middle, and the middle is indistinguishable from the bottom. So we have a conference that is all about parity, but not all about separation. And one of the best teams in that conference already has a loss to Mississippi State, one of the teams that we expect to finish near the bottom of the SEC. And then G5, this is one spot. This is not changing. This is a contract spot, and that is all there is available for them. So that's what we've got for this week. Look for the primer in a couple of days for week 4, and we will be back with you after the conclusion of that week. Till then, thanks for listening. Roll Tide.